All right. Hey, everybody. This is Git Help, an intro to PowerShell and how to use it for evil. My name is Jared Haight. I'm a security engineer with the Charlotte team with Gotham Digital Science. Before that, I was a sysadmin for a long time, primarily focused on Windows, but being a sysadmin, that kind of covers anything with blinky lights on it, so definitely got my hands on all sorts of stuff. For fun, I develop web apps and just stuff like that. Never been a professional developer, but it's fun to screw around with. And if you do the Twitter thing, I'm at Jared Haight, and I retweet interesting people. So what I wanted to do with this presentation is kind of give an overview of how easy it is to get into PowerShell. I've been an advocate for PowerShell pretty much since it came out. I think it's definitely one of the coolest things that Microsoft has going on right now, both from a sysadmin perspective and from an offensive perspective. This presentation isn't going to be terribly in-depth. I don't expect anybody to leave here and become a PowerShell master. More just want to get the point across of how approachable and easy to use the language is. I also want to showcase some of the really cool stuff going on as far as offensive security goes. There's a lot of really cool frameworks and stuff out there. As I kind of hinted at before, we're going to be talking about developer stuff, scripting and variables and stuff like that. And I am not a developer. I have no idea what I'm talking about. So you picked the right presentation. I'm entirely self-taught. So I get terms mixed up. I may not be entirely accurate in how I'm describing stuff works. For an intro level course, it's going to be fine though. What I've taught myself has at least worked for me. So vocabulary may be off. You may get into PowerShell and a couple years down the road be like, oh, that Jared kid had no idea what he was talking about. That's fine. I just need you to pretend I know what I'm talking about right now. So the reason I think PowerShell is important, especially for information security standpoint, for red teamers, PowerShell is this incredibly powerful object-oriented language that's part of Windows, from Windows 7 on up. So it gives you access to the entire .NET framework. It gives you access to WMI, and it's incredibly easy to use. The other great thing about it is the blue teams, the incident response teams, aren't looking out for PowerShell. And it's actually really hard to log and monitor PowerShell. It wasn't until Windows 10 that logging of PowerShell events really became a thing. For blue teams, it's important because it is what actual bad guys are using for their nefarious deeds. There have been a couple instances recently where APTs have used PowerShell to execute code on their bots. Deep Panda was a group that was attacking national think tanks or national security think tanks. And what they were doing, they were using scheduled tasks that would execute PowerShell to download and run remote access tools and stuff like that. More interestingly, APT29, what they were doing, they had a C2 network, a command and control network, that was all through Twitter DMs. So their bots would check into these accounts, get the DMs, and execute the PowerShell that was being sent via direct messages over Twitter. With getting started in PowerShell, I'm assuming a lot of people here have scripting knowledge. This is going to be just old hat for you, but I do want to kind of get us all on the same page. For the purposes of this talk, when we talk about strings, we're talking about characters that ultimately you're going to be printing out to screen. Strings are just chunks of text. They can be letters or numbers, but when you think string, think I'm going to be printing this out to screen. Integers are, just like you learned in math, they're numbers. In the context of this talk, it's numbers you're going to be doing math with. You can have numbers that are strings, you can convert those to integers, and that's all well and good. It's outside the scope of really what I want to cover here today. For our purposes, integers mean math, strings mean printing to screen. You also have Booleans. When we start talking about logic, Boolean just means is this true or false? It's kind of a unique value in a scripting language that you use for logic. And a variable is just a way to reference data throughout your script or program. An example of that is if you have a script that is going to print a message to screen, and it's going to generate the content of that message based off what happens within the script. You can assign whatever you want printed to screen in a variable throughout the script, and then at the end of your script, just have a single line that prints whatever the contents of that variable is. So objects are kind of an abstract concept, and it's not something I really felt comfortable with until I played around with them for a while. The way I look at an object is it's a type of something, and being a type of something, it inherits properties and methods that are relevant to its type. So a good example of that is taking a string, right? A string is an object in PowerShell, and it has properties for length, where we have a variable here, variable string, we call the length property. It tells us, hey, there's 4 characters in this string. It also has a method called toUpper, which will capitalize all the letters in that string. As you get into more advanced things in PowerShell, really everything's an object. So one thing you deal with a lot, at least on the sysadmin side, is ADUser objects. An ADUser object is going to have properties for first name, last name, username, stuff like that. And it's going to have methods to change the user's password or maybe add them to a group. Objects are really part of what makes PowerShell so great because it lets you interact with things real easily. Arrays are just a list of objects. It can be anything. It could be strings, numbers. It could be any combination of objects, but basically it's just objects separated by commas. In this case, we have a variable list. We're assigning an array of the words 1, 2, and 3 to it. One of the cool things about arrays is you can reference any object in that array using its index. And we're doing that here for the last 2 lines by calling a bracket, 0 bracket. That's going to give us the first item in the array. In this case, bracket 2 bracket gives us the last item. So your index starts at 0. Continuing the PowerShell intro here, everything we've talked about so far is real general scripting stuff. With PowerShell, one of the really cool things about it is it has what it calls commandlets. And they're just essentially tiny little programs you use to interact with stuff. It's going to be the majority of the stuff you do in PowerShell, you're going to be running commandlets. What's neat about it, they've established this methodology or this methodology where all your commandlets are going to be in a verb-noun format. So that makes PowerShell a very verbose language, but it also makes it very readable and very easy to figure out what you're doing or what you're trying to do. It makes it intuitive as well. So one of the examples I have up on screen here is set clipboard. So you can call set clipboard, you give it a string, it's going to send that string to your clipboard. If you want to get the contents of clipboard, it's probably get-clipboard, and that's going to return whatever is stored in the clipboard. Once you get the variables down, once you learn the objects or whatever you're interacting with, PowerShell becomes a pretty intuitive language to work around with. It's a great beginner's language. Some of the cool things about PowerShell being a modern language is everything's tab completable. So that includes commandlets, that includes the parameters of the commandlets, and in some cases actually includes the parameter values that that commandlet takes if they're predefined. The other cool thing is PowerShell includes a ISE by default, which is just a IDE for working with PowerShell. It inherits some of the Visual Studio coolness, so that includes like IntelliSense, if you're familiar with that. It's a very powerful autocomplete functionality. And it also has a sidebar that will list every commandlet that's on the computer that you're working on. And you can drill in through that sidebar and it will tell you all of the parameters that that commandlet takes. So real easy to explore around, get a feel for what you're trying to do. You can also see in the main window on the left here. So what I've done here is I've gotten a directory object by just basically doing a dir c. And IntelliSense is telling me gives me a list of every property and method that's associated with that directory object just by working with the variable. So pretty cool stuff. I can't talk for PowerShell straight for an hour, so here's a bunny.
Are there more bunnies?
Yes, yeah, there will be regular bunnies and some puppies towards the end. So great, we know the basics of working with PowerShell. We know the basics of what we're actually working with, our strings, objects, stuff like that. Making it do stuff, the most basic thing you're gonna do is a for loop. In PowerShell, really straightforward, it uses for each. So in the example here, we have an array of the words 1, 2, and 3. We're assigning that to the variable list. And then we're calling a for each item in list, and we're gonna run a chunk of code. In this case, it's just print out an asterisk and whatever the item is. So you can see in the output on the right-hand side there, real straightforward, *1, *2, etc. A more practical example of this is taking what was shown in the ISE earlier. We're going to get an array of all of the file system objects on the root of C, and we do that with getChildItem. And actually, if you run dir or ls in PowerShell, those are both aliases for getChildItem. What's cool about getChildItem, as I mentioned, is it actually, instead of just giving you a list of, like a plain text list of what's on the drive, it actually returns an array of objects. So we're going to take that array of objects, we assign it to the variable dirs, and we iterate through. And we say, okay, for each dir in the dirs array, we're going to write out the full name, which is just the path. We write out a separator. The directory object has a method called getAccessControl, which returns an access control list. We run that, we assign it to the variable ACL, and then we take that ACL object, and it has a property of access to string, which gets us our NTFS permissions as a string. We print that out, we print out a blank line, and we go back through our for loop. The output for this looks like this. You get your path for the directory, a separator, and the NTFS permissions. So for loops are great, but they're dumb. And we can do smarter things with programming. That's why we have programming. When we talk about logic in scripting or programming, it really amounts to if something is true, do X. The way we figure out if something is true is we compare it to whatever we want to compare it to. With PowerShell, you compare things with dash and then two-letter acronyms. It's a little bit different than maybe Python or Ruby, where you're used to bang equals and stuff like that. I've used the two-letter acronyms in bash scripting before. I don't know if it has further history than that. There's a lot of Linux references through PowerShell. It's kind of cool. They actually have aliases now for wget and curl built into PowerShell that just call a get web requests, which is kind of cool. So the most basic form of a logic statement is just an if-else statement. So in the example here, we're taking a list of numbers, an array of numbers, the integers 1 through 10, and we're iterating through with a for loop. We're getting each number out of that array. We're checking to see if the number equals 4. If it does, we write that out, so this number is 4. Else, we write out that it's not 4. On the output, on the right-hand side, you can see kind of what that looks like when it runs. The last thing about logic that I want to cover is a while loop. And really, a while loop just says, you're comparing something. As long as that evaluates to true, it's going to keep running whatever that block of code is. And it's going to run that block of code over and over again, each time comparing what's in the while loop to make sure that it's still true. So in our example here, we're taking the variable I, we're assigning that then integer of 1, and then we're checking to see that while I is less than or equal to the number 4, we're going to run this block of code. Real straightforward, it prints out whatever the contents of I is, and then increments I up by 1. So our output on the right-hand side there is just the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So knowing what we work with in PowerShell, our objects, our strings, our variables, knowing how to logic stuff out, you can literally do anything in PowerShell now. The first 6 to 8 months that I was scripting in PowerShell, everything I wrote was just a really glorified, very long if-else statement, basically. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't pretty. Anybody who had any experience with scripting would have throttled me. But the scripts got their jobs done, and that's really kind of all that matters when you're starting out. To figure out how to use PowerShell and how to use what's available to you, there are 3 things that I typically find myself using. The first commandlet is git command, and that just lets you search all the commandlets and all the programs in your path for a string. So in the example here, we're searching for anything that ends with the word clipboard. So that's going to get us get clipboard, set clipboard, etc. The help system in PowerShell, you access it through git help, or there's an alias for man, again, Linux throwback. The help system is surprisingly well written. It's obviously written by people that have used these commandlets practically. And one of the cool things about git help is the examples parameter that you can throw in. So in the case here, we're doing a git help write host dash examples, and it's going to print out, I think when I ran it was 4 or 5 examples of how to print stuff to screen. So just really a lot of great examples. One that I use all the time is git date. I can never remember how the formatting works for git date. There's, I think, 11 examples in the help command, and usually one of those is exactly the formatting that I'm looking for. The last thing that's really helpful is git member. What git member does is you can send an object to git member, and it will give you a list of all the properties and methods that that object has. You do that by just taking the object and piping it to git member. So the output for that looks something like this. We're taking our directory object from before, piping that to git member, and it returns a long list of methods and properties that are associated with that object. I love this one. Bunnies are jerks. I own a bunny. He is a jerk. All right, so let's start putting all this together and actually do something practical. What I want to do is we're going to take the script from before where we've got the NTFS permissions, and we're going to make it a bit more intelligent and a bit more useful. We start out basically the same. We call get child item, get an array of file system objects, return that to the variable DIRs, and then we go into a for each loop. Where we start to change things, though, is the first thing we're going to do is we're going to declare an I variable, because I like the letter I. We're going to call that 0. Now, before what we did, when we got our ACL, is we called access to string. And that just returned a chunk of text that was the NTFS permissions. And we could chop that up and we can get what we're looking for. Probably should have mentioned, what I want to do here is I want to find permissions that apply to the everyone group. And we can do that with access to string. There's definitely string manipulation in PowerShell. We can do things easier and more efficiently. The way we're going to do this is the ACL object also has an access property. That access property is an array of access control entry objects. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that I variable and we're going to call through the index of that access property list and start working with the access control entries by themselves. So we do that with our while loop. We check, hey, as long as, I'm going to call access bracket 0 bracket, as long as we start incrementing through that and it doesn't return a null or, just nothing, this while loop's going to be true and it's going to run its code. Into the while loop, we know we have an access control entry. We assign that to the variable ACE. And what I did putting this together was used git member to figure out kind of what I was looking for and how I can work with this ACE object. So I found out, I need to find out who these permissions apply to, and I want to find out what those permissions are. The identity reference parameter is the parameter in that ACE that tells us who this ACE applies to. So we're able to do an if statement. If that identity reference parameter contains the word everyone, we want to do something with it. We go back, we write out the full path, our separator, and then we write out just simply the identity reference, who this ACE applies to, and we write out the file system rights, which using git member and playing around a bit, we figured out that's how we find out what the permissions are in that ACE. We increment up by 1, and we go back into our while loop and keep iterating through that array of ACEs. The full code looks like this, 19 lines. And to go through real quickly again, we get our directories, we iterate through, we get the ACL from that directory, and then we start going through its access control entries. In that while loop, we keep iterating through the access control entries. Once we're out of access control entries, we're back into our for loop, and we move on to the next directory and continue the process. So again, this time the output, we're just looking for anything that contains everyone. And on running this on my laptop, we got back users, which is expected, and sandbox, which apparently Sandboxy wants everyone to have full access to that folder, which confuses me and has since been fixed. All right, so some of the unique things about PowerShell that make it pretty cool. There's the concept of PS drives. And what a PS drive is it's kind of like a virtual file system. So in the example here, we're actually working through the registry as if it was a file system. We just change directory into HKeyCU, so HKey current users. And then from there, we can switch between keys, and we can also start creating objects. One of the cool commandlets that comes into play is test path, which you feed it a path either with any PS drive supported thing. So it could be a file system, UNC, registry. It will check to see if that path exists and return true or false. So in this example, we check to see if we have a key for BSidesCHS. We don't, so we go ahead and create it with new item. And then we create a value in that registry key of demo with the value of text goes here, because I ran out of original things to do there. One of the nice things about PowerShell being a modern language is it's network aware. So UNC paths work natively, and a lot of the commandlets, especially those provided by Microsoft, will work on remote computers. So in the example of the stop service commandlet, what we're doing here is we're stopping the spooler service on a remote PC. That will come into play when we talk about frameworks. The other cool thing is it integrates with Windows RM, which is Windows Remote Management Service. That lets us do two pretty cool things. One is we can run the enter PS session command, which is kind of like SSH, but PowerShell, until PowerShell actually gets proper SSH, which is coming. By using the enter PS session command, you actually drop into a PowerShell prompt on a remote PC. You can also do invoke command and invoke expression, which are both ways to execute just raw PowerShell code on a remote PC. So when I put this together, I didn't realize until after I'd kind of looked at the slides a couple times that, well, thank you, sir. That puppy break is a terrible, terrible pun for this GIF. All right, so now the fun stuff. There is an incredible amount of talent in the offensive security, like PowerShell community. There really is frameworks and modules for any stage of a pen test or engagement that you want to do. Recon, data exfiltration, backdoors. There's been an incredible amount of work done. And what's cool is A lot of the standout members and the people kind of driving all of this, they have a very mature methodology to how they approach pen testing. And this has led to a big focus on in-memory attacks with PowerShell. A lot of the PowerShell code we work with offensively doesn't touch disk. It runs entirely in memory, so it is a lot less likely to trip AV, it's a lot harder to track down, and makes our jobs pretty great. Using a framework in PowerShell is really easy. Basically, there are modules. So what you do is you clone down the repo that you're trying to use, and you run the import module command. A lot of times you can point import module at just the folder of the repo. Sometimes you have to point it at a PS1 file or a PSM1 file. That's kind of just trial and error to figure out what works for whatever framework you're working with. So the first framework I want to talk about is a framework by Manifestation called POWERSPLOIT. And it has a lot of modules, a lot of great stuff to use in it. Two of the things that are relatively unique to it are its ability to modify scripts. So you can take a PowerShell script that you've written and pipe it through his framework, and it will either encode or encrypt the script and kind of hide it from plain sight. I specifically am not going to use the word obfuscate. I think that's how you pronounce it. But yeah, it's pretty handy. The other cool thing about it is it has a mayhem module, and that's a real rare thing to see in a framework, is just a module for, hey, let's fuck shit up. And I really, really appreciate that he has that. So some of the things I definitely would highlight in PowerSploit are, he has a invoke ninja copy commandlet. And what invoke ninja copy does is it gets around file system locks and ACLs. The way it does this is it actually reads the raw volume data from the hard drive and then recreates the NTFS structures to make those files. We're going to be using that in a demo later to good effect. The other great thing that has is invoke mimikatz. If you're not familiar with mimikatz, it's a tool that will dump credentials from memory on a Windows box. So it looks out for LSASS and a couple other processes, and we'll get just up into Windows 8 or 8.1, it gets plain text credentials just from memory. And there's ways you can make it work in 8.1 as well. The cool thing about invoke mimikatz is it runs in memory itself. So from your computer that you're working off of, you just point it at a remote computer, and it will bring back, passwords and credentials from that remote computer. The Mayhem module, like I mentioned, is really great. One of the cool things about it is it has the set master boot record commandlet, which just lets you overwrite the MBR with whatever string you want to put. PowerTools, which is now part of the Empire framework. It's not part of Bail anymore. PowerTools is started by SixDub and Harmjoy and has a lot of great stuff. They're really focused on massive engagements. So there's a lot of code that is focused on multi-threaded attacks. There's also a lot of network awareness code. So PowerView is their module for network awareness. What's cool about PowerView is it has several commandlets that let you do user hunting. What that means is you'll run user hunter and it will find who the domain admin accounts are on the network and then find where they are logged in on the network so you can start attacking their PCs directly. The other cool thing is the Pew 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 module, which besides being a great name for a module, it focuses on multi-threaded attacks or command execution. It includes a module for invoke mass mimikatz, which takes the invoke mimikatz from PowerSploit and runs it against everything on the network and just starts grabbing credentials from whatever it can possibly reach out to. Technically, it's really interesting because the way it does this is they use the multi-threading, which is kind of native in PowerShell, but they spin up a HTTP server in PowerShell, and that's how they're actually receiving all the requests back, which is a really cool approach. The last project I want to talk about is Nishang, which is Niching is a huge project. The dude just obviously enjoys creating random awesomeness. And it's actively developed. There's a lot of stuff going on with it. The two things I want to focus on here is the client module, which allows you to easily inject PowerShell into Word docs or CHM files, stuff like that. What's cool about that, basically, it'll create a macro, at least in Office docs, that will go out and either execute the PowerShell you give it or download a PS1 file from the internet and execute that. It also has some really unique approaches to backdoors. The first backdoor I want to talk about is the DNS text ponage backdoor. What that does is you point it to a domain, and it will query that domain for text records and treat those text records as executable PowerShell. The other great thing is gupt backdoor. What gupt backdoor does is it looks for wireless networks that are available to the PC. It doesn't connect to them, but it checks the SID. And if the first 4 characters of that SID match a magic string that you define, like a password, it then checks the 5th character of the SID. If the 5th character of the SID is a C, it treats the rest of that SID as PowerShell and just executes it. If the 5th character of that SID is a U, it treats the rest of that SID as a Google short URL and goes out and downloads the PS1 file or whatever it's pointed to and executes that as PowerShell. That is totally off the wall, and I love the devious bastard that came up with that. So I want to do a quick demo here that hopefully will work without issue. All right, so in this example, we've compromised a help desk user account. Oh, that's good. And like a lot of corporate environments, the help desk has admin rights on laptops and desktops and stuff like that, but they don't have access to the servers. And what I want to do is I want to get the Active Directory database and get that off the network so I can crack it and do my thing. So the first thing I want to do is find myself an admin. So what we're going to do here is import PowerTools PowerView module. That's not what I want. I'm really nervous I'm going to spill my beer. All right. And we're going to run invoke user hunter. All right, so that found our domain admin. His username is Mr. Admin. He's logged into demo client 2. So we want to run Mimikatz against him. This environment uses Windows 7, so we're in luck there. To use Mimikatz, that's in the PowerSploit repos. So Windows Defender, Windows 10, Windows Defender on Windows 10 does detect invoke Mimikatz as a malicious file. There are ways to get around that. We can talk about that when it's not being recorded, but it's fine for our purposes. Invoke Mimikatz. And we're going to point that to demo client 2. Sweet. All right, so we have passwords. All right, so username is Mr. Admin, password is God Complex, and what we're going to do is start a new PowerShell window as the admin. So Mr. Admin. Cool. All right, so we have domain admin rights. We need to get our Active Directory database. So first thing we need to do is figure out what our DCs are. There are any number of ways to do this. Because this is a PowerShell talk, we are going to use PowerShell. Part of Power View under Power Tools is a lot of AD enumeration sort of stuff. And one of those things is getting at domain controller? Yeah. All right. So this tells us what our domain is, what the DC is running, what its roles are, and what its host name is. So we're going to use, now to get that AD database, we're going to use invoke ninja copy from PowerSploit. Let me clear this out for you guys. Yes. All right, so invoke ninja copy, we need to specify the path that we're trying to copy, which in this case is C Windows ntds ntds.dit. We want to specify what computer we're copying it from, which in this case is demo DC01. And we need to specify where we want to copy files to. For ease of use, we're just going to copy it to our repos. Whoa, no. That's never happened. Yeah, it did complete path. C Windows tds.dit. Let's try that again. Local destination is C repos tds.dit, and computer name is demo DC01. I wonder if it was tripping on the capital NTDS in that path. Weird. This is going to take a second because, like I said, it's actually reading raw volume data and kind of restructuring that back into NTFS stuff. Cool. All right, so we have our Active Directory database downloaded. We can exfiltrate that using either some of the tools that we have available to us through the frameworks, or we could just copy it to a USB key if the organization lets us do that. One thing I wanted to do for this demo, because I never get to do this in real life, is rec this box. So we're going to start a administrative prompt. And we're going to import PowerSploit. Yeah. And we're going to set the master boot record to like lead hacksaw. Yes, I do want to screw up my computer. Come on. Ha. All right. So the last framework I wanted to talk about today is a framework called Empire. And Empire is an amazing piece of work. It was debuted at the most recent BSides, DEF CON, or Black Hat, one of the three. And basically, Empire is a complete PowerShell post-exploitation remote access kit. It's kind of like Meterpreter, but entirely written in PowerShell, and includes a lot of the modules and tools that I covered today, and then some. What's great about it is they have a strong focus on cryptographically secure communications. They have a strong focus on unique memory footprints. So when you set up Empire, it's a client-server model, like you'd expect. You need a Linux box, you clone the Empire repo, run the config scripts. When you do the install, or when you run those configuration scripts, one of the things it does is it generates like a 32 or 64 character string. And it uses that to encrypt all of the payloads that you generate. So in theory, every version of Empire is going to generate different code. So it's incredibly hard to track down signatures for it. As the server, to get it up and running, you need to set up endpoints, which are just HTTP listeners, basically. And then it features, you generate the launchers, which are just PowerShell code that you run on the remote client. It has a couple ways to do this, including a ducky script. So if you have a rubber ducky, you'll just generate the native ducky script for that. Run the code on the remote boxes and receive shells. One of the cool things about it is it's a phone home architecture. So instead of having a persistent connection back to the server, the client's phone home at whatever interval you specified, usually 5-10 seconds. So from a network perspective, you just see an outbound HTTPS connection every 5-10 seconds. It's incredibly hard to track down and really cool stuff. So one thing I wanted to cover again before I wrap up here, if you're in blue teams, PowerShell isn't just an offensive tool. There's a lot of really cool stuff in the data forensics, incident response areas that have been built in PowerShell. One of the standout, a couple of the standout frameworks, POSSEC framework is really cool because it's a custom PowerShell console built for incident response and data forensics. It was written by a dude named Ben 10. And he wrote it for his internal teams that he was working with to make PowerShell more accessible and easier to use for some of the newer folks on the team. Another great site to check out is invoke-ir, which is a PowerShell-focused collection of projects run by Jared Caddickson, I believe is his name. Two of the standout projects there are Power Forensics, which focuses on data forensics, and Uproot, which is an IDS written purely in PowerShell. The last framework that I've heard a lot about in incident response, I unfortunately haven't played with it much, is Concept. And that focuses largely on information gathering and baselining. So reading event logs, figuring out what you have out there, setting up baselines. All very cool stuff. So like I said, I don't expect anybody to leave here being a PowerShell expert. I hopefully have at least let you know how easy it is to start that path. If you want to take things from here, Microsoft has a great site, their Microsoft Virtual Academy, which really, if you want to learn any Microsoft technology, they have like hours and hours of CBT and stuff like that up on there. A lot of great stuff with PowerShell up on that site. Learn PowerShell in a Month of Lunches is a book that I've seen recommended a lot. I haven't read it personally. The way I learned PowerShell is just really through Google. I would find stuff that I wanted to play with or find stuff that I wanted to do and just poked around at it until I kind of figured out what I wanted to do. I find that's really one of the best ways to pick up any real new programming language. It's incredibly easy to spin up a lab and play with this stuff. The lab I used for my demo here is 3 servers, 3 VMs. It's a Windows 2012 box, a Windows 7 box, and a Windows 10 box. And I'm all running the eval licenses for that. Whoop, that is totally not what I meant to do. Let's try that again. There we go. So I definitely want to highlight the people that wrote all those cool frameworks. They're the guys that are actually doing really interesting stuff with PowerShell as opposed to just telling you how to use it. Sixstep, Harmjoy, and Enigma all contributed to the Empire project, which I can't tell you how much I appreciate and love that. Manifestation is with PowerSploit. Nicole Mitt, it does Nishang. Jared Catexon is with InvokeIR, and Ben 10 did the POSHSec framework. All these guys are really great people to follow if you're interested in PowerShell in the InfoSec community. So wrapping up, if we have any questions, I have a couple minutes I can answer those. Shoot.
You mentioned monitoring for these types of attacks and so forth. You did in Windows 10 was primarily, how about tools like Sysmon and things like that that are kind of intended to, I know that they provide functionality for that.
Yeah, so it depends on the level of attack, I think, as to how much success you would have with Sysmon. One of the cool things that I didn't talk about, but so when you, PowerShell is not PowerShell.exe. PowerShell is actually just a DLL that's part of the Windows management framework. And so Empire and a lot of these guys just take that DLL and inject it into another process. So it's not even that you're looking for PowerShell.exe, like you actually have to look at what DLLs are loaded. And
Well, with
kind
reference, like, because I know a lot of them you can do like command line execution and things like that. Would you see it there, would you have to look for it a different way? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like,
I think you would have to look for it a different way, but I break things, I don't try to fix them. So,
no, I know there's a lot of efforts to try to monitor.
Yeah, exactly,
Really,
exactly.
Obviously, if you're injecting it into another process, you referenced by that process, so maybe you could do a check for that DLL.
Yes, yeah.
That'd be what you'd want to do.
Yeah, and my understanding from a blue team perspective is that it's really hard to, right now at least, to figure out, you know, without getting real deep into like memory forensics and stuff like that, kind of what PowerShell is doing when it's not doing its normal thing. So, cool. All right, well, like I said, if you're on Twitter, I am at Jared Haight. If you are in the Charlotte area, me and a bunch of friends get together regularly, Charlotte hackers, and we just meet up and drink beer and talk about hacking. And if you are on the job market, Gotham Digital Science is hiring, and we do a lot of really, really cool stuff. So check us out. Thanks, guys.